I'll just open up mostly for the benefit of those who aren't actually here at the webinar by kicking things off and reminding everybody that this is now our 7th of 8 webinars as part of the ClimateX project, which is what's been a really productive collaboration between the founders of ClimateX, Rajesh and Dave, and also I should mention Kurt Newton's really deep and helpful involvement, and the Office of Digital Learning, which is where Kurt and I both work. And this collaboration is about finding ways to create more meaningful engagement between MIT and the outside world. And we've been doing this for 8 weeks with these webinars, but we also have a website called climatex.mit.edu. And this is a space where we'd like to encourage deeper conversations around issues regarding climate action and climate change. And we are very committed at ODL to making this a success. So we've started this first 8 weeks as an experiment, but we have every intention of taking what we've learned from these 8 weeks and moving forward to build an even stronger platform that is going to allow even richer forms of engagement. So we really appreciate everybody who has tuned in and is watching this webinar. And we really encourage you, if you have any ideas for how to make this a better experience, to contact us directly. We're a small team, but we're very responsive to any kind of feedback that we get. So with that, I'll let Rajesh introduce us to our panelists today, which should be really a great session.
Thank you, Mark. I also want to reiterate, by the way, I'm Rajesh Kasturirangan, one of the co-founders of ClimateX, along with Dave Damlor. We run our worldwide operation from our living rooms. So thank you very much for being with us. And I'm really, really happy to have Quinton Zondervan with us today. Quinton and ClimateX go a long ways back, because Quinton is, along with me and Dave, one of the members of the MIT Alumni for Climate Action Leadership, which was the even more world-dominating organization that spawned ClimateX. And we want to be doing as many things as we can as MIT alumni to make the world a better place. So Quinton, on top of Medi-Cal, has done many, many other climate action leadership activities. So I'm going to let Quinton introduce himself and as to how he came to climate action.
Thank you, Rajesh, and very happy and excited to be here and see this project come to fruition. So for me, it really started when I was in college. I learned about climate change, or global warming as we called it then, from a fellow student who became a friend. And he explained to me what was going on in the atmosphere and what the implications were for our future. And ever since then, I've been a climate activist. And most recently, I helped to found the Climate Action Business Association to bring the voice of business leaders into climate action, because I feel that's really, really important for our success.
And Kaba is right behind Quinton.
Yes, and all around me, in fact.
Right.
We have a new office here at the Old West Church in Boston, so it's pretty exciting.
So Quinton, tell us how you got to essentially full-time climate action work from being someone who was a student activist.
Right. Well, so when I first learned about it in the late 80s and early 90s, we were actually anticipating the Rio conference, which was the first UN conference that was going to start dealing with climate change. And so as students, we participated in that process and then graduated and thought, well, the adults will take care of the problem. And so I went on to have a career and, start a family. And of course, came to MIT to do my graduate studies. And of course, it began to dawn on me that, no, they're not solving the problem, it's getting worse. And so I re-engaged with the issue. I joined the Climate Protection Action Committee in Cambridge, which advises the city government on climate policy issues. I then joined a local nonprofit called Green Cambridge and became the president of that organization to galvanize more local action in Cambridge specifically, and helped to found the Climate Action Business Association. So just over time, I've continued to try to broaden the audience and the membership, really, of people taking action on climate change, because we can't do it alone.
Right. Thanks, Quinton. So today's session is really about the economics of climate action and how we can use economic policy to regulate carbon emissions. And that's a huge topic. So, tell us a little bit about, both the macro and the micro characteristics of not just carbon pricing, but maybe more generally economic regulation of climate.
Right. So this is really carbon pricing is a kind of Pigovian tax, right? So Arthur Pigou, about 100 years ago, came up with this idea that there could be positive and negative side effects of economic activity, and that one way to regulate those would be to tax the negative aspects and to share the positive aspects with all the participants. And so this principle has actually been applied in other pollution settings already successfully in the US, and with carbon pricing in many other countries in the world and jurisdictions. So it's really, long past time that we started doing this in the US. But for various reasons, there has been resistance to it. And one of the things that we really focus on at CABA is to work with business leaders who are, in a way, natural allies on this issue, because a lot of business leaders understand the economic advantages of doing climate action through carbon pricing. It creates the right incentives for them to take action on climate change.
That's great. Now, of course, we have viewers from across the world, and to be frank, it's maybe not dominant, but definitely a very vocal American attitude towards carbon pricing is, you will pry the steering wheel from my cold dead hands, right? So tell us a little bit about the politics behind carbon pricing in this country, right? Because I think in other parts of the world, it's not quite the same.
Yeah, it's, all politics is local, and so we have our own flavor of challenges, but carbon pricing or carbon tax is actually one of the few carbon or climate policies that is appealing to conservatives, politically conservative people in the US. Now, of course, they have to first accept that climate change is real, which some people do. And then once they accept that, then they say, well, we still want minimal government regulation to deal with the problem. And it turns out that a carbon tax is the best solution in that sense, right? Now, on the progressive side, there's an active debate about whether the taxes that are then collected should be returned to the people or should be used by government to take action on the problem. So invest in renewable energy, public transit systems, and so forth. So that's a legitimate debate that goes on the left, and you know, that's played out interestingly in Washington State recently, and also British Columbia and Canada. But you know, the really good thing about carbon pricing as a policy solution is that it can garner bipartisan support, and so therefore has a real chance of making a difference.
Right. And tell us the specifics of how a carbon, let's call it carbon pricing, even though, you know, some people might prefer to call it carbon tax. But again, yeah, that's the price we pay, pun intended, for being in this country. How exactly does a carbon price work?
So it's a pretty simple idea, which is that this is actually a conservative principle. If you want less of something, tax it, right? So you put a tax on the amount of carbon pollution that is emitted. So for example, if you drive a car that has a combustion engine, then it emits a certain amount of carbon dioxide, which is contributing to global warming. So if we translated that emission into a tax that you would pay, let's say, when you buy the gasoline, so anticipating that you're going to burn it and emit that pollution, then, and we make that clear to you that you're paying a little bit extra because of the pollution you're generating, then we create an incentive for people to try to pollute less, right? So they'll say, well, I don't like paying this tax, so you know, I'll drive less, or I'll buy a more fuel-efficient car, or maybe even an electric vehicle. So the idea is to make it a little bit more expensive to pollute, and thereby create an incentive for people to reduce their pollution. Now, the flip side, of course, is that if you just do that, then you've created a regressive tax, because you know, people who can afford it the least are going to be the most bothered by it. So the flip side then is what we call a rebate, right, or a dividend, so that you collect the tax revenues, and then you pay all or most of it back to the taxpayers, but in an equal way, so that everybody gets the same amount back. And so if you structure that right, then the people who pollute the most will get back the least, and the people who pollute the least might actually get back more than they pay, right? And so you actually reward them for being low polluters, because pollution is correlated with spending, right? So the more money you have to spend, the more likely it is that you're generating pollution. So just to give a simple example, like if you and I were the only two people participating in this tax, right? And suppose that, you know, I generated $3 worth of pollution and you generated $1 worth of pollution. And so we would pay that into a pot. And so we'd have collected $4, we divide it by 2, and each of us gets $2 back, right? And so because I polluted more, I actually paid the price for that. I lost $1 and you gained $1. And so that creates an incentive for me to say, hey, wait a minute, you know, I want to actually gain on this game, so I'm going to reduce my pollution, right? And then as everybody does that, you get over time a significant reduction in pollution. And also, because it's predictable, right? Because you set the price ahead of time, and you set a schedule for how the price is going to increase over time. So that creates visibility for businesses and governments and individuals to invest in technologies that help reduce pollution, right? Because now they know that if there's a cost for people to pollute, then that creates an opportunity to provide alternative products that would reduce people's tax exposure, because they would now, there would be more demand for those kind of products.
So, okay, so let me start asking slightly tougher questions. I think that the basic principle seems quite rational, right? That you tax people at the point of energy carbon consumption. Now that could be gasoline, that could be other forms of carbon. And then you collect that money and then you distribute it according to, actually equally, as you just said, right? So it's a revenue neutral tax.
Right. You
Is
could
it-
keep some of the revenues, but you still have to return most of it to avoid negative impacts.
So how does it differentiate between individuals and businesses? I mean, is there a policy difference there, or are organizations and individuals treated the same?
Right. So those are all policy choices that can be made in different jurisdictions. In Massachusetts, the bill that we proposed in previous session separated individual consumers and businesses. So they would pay into separate pots, and then they would get the revenues back according to different calculations. So the individuals would just get back per capita, right? So you just take the population of Massachusetts and you divide by that number to get the amount returned to individual consumers. And then businesses would be paid back based on full-time employee equivalent. And the idea there was, there's other ideas out there where the businesses might get a tax reduction on their corporate taxes. But one thing that's a little bit unique about Massachusetts is that we have a very large nonprofit sector, because all the universities, most of the hospitals are nonprofit. And so if you did a tax reduction for business entities, then you would end up hurting your nonprofits. But if you did a rebate based on employees, then it's more fair and allows nonprofits to participate equally.
Very interesting nuance. So you brought up the issue of Massachusetts, and I know that you've been very active in getting carbon pricing bill into the Massachusetts State House. So tell us a little bit about the mechanics of how these things work. I want a carbon tax, but what do I do?
Right. Yeah, it's very challenging, right? So the legislative session is 2 years. It's basically a year and a half, but on the calendar 2 years. And during that time, you put forward a bill, and then you try to build support, for passing it. This previous session was the second time that we attempted to pass a carbon tax. And it is not unusual for it to take multiple attempts. So what you want to do as you go is measure your success, not by that we pass it or not, but how much support were we able to build, right? And is the momentum moving us in the right direction? And so what happened in the previous session was extremely encouraging for all of us, which is that we almost got to a vote in the Senate, which is great. And then we also organized a hearing on this bill, which was the first ever hearing in Massachusetts on this concept. So those are both measures of real progress. The challenge in passing it, let's say in the next session, is that climate change and environmental issues generally are not top of the list for most people and most legislators. And then on top of that, when you introduce something that's fairly new to people, it takes a lot of time for them to understand it, to get used to it, and to decide, yes, this is something I can support. And so the biggest thing that all of us can do as citizens to make this happen is to first educate ourselves on the issue enough that we can explain it to friends and other people in layman's terms, and then communicate our support to our legislators and communicate the urgency of taking this particular action. There's a lot of interest in energy issues. People like solar panels, and maybe we'll invent fusion someday. So there's a lot of focus on that aspect of climate mitigation. But all the models that I've seen show that if we don't put in place something like a carbon price, we don't reduce our emissions fast enough to avoid a lot of the damage that climate change is causing. So it's really important and really urgent that we focus attention on ways that we can get people broadly in the economy to reduce their pollution. And a price on carbon is the best way by far to accomplish that.
So tell us, it's good to have some hard numbers. So in the proposals that are in the Massachusetts State House, how much is it going to be? Like if I buy a gallon of gas, how much more money will I pay for it if that tax passes?
Right, so it would be initially about 9 cents, and then it would go up, so $10 a ton equivalent. And then it would go up by about 4 or 5 cents a year for 7 years, right? And so we'd end up around 30, 40 cents per gallon at the end of a carbon tax on gasoline. And then, it's equivalent numbers for natural gas and other carbon sources.
So, I mean, it's not a trivial amount, but it is definitely less than, say, variation you might see in gas prices over the course of a few years anyway.
That's exactly right. And so, one of the attacks from the left, if you will, is, well, this isn't good enough. It's like 30 cents, who cares, right? After 6 or 7 years. But the key thing is that it's really important to get started and to start low, because if you start high, then you are imposing a significant economic burden on people, and that causes problems. And also, it takes people time to respond. I mean, if I'm going to buy a new car or a more efficient car, it might take me a few years before I decide that trading in my old car is worth it. So you want to leave enough time for people to start responding to the price signal. You don't want to hit them with a hammer, if you will. So it is important to start low, but it's also important to build in that escalator so that people can see predictably the price is going to go up, right, over time, because then they start incorporating that into their decision making, right? To say, well, when I do change my car or change my decisions about how I move around, I know it's going to be even more expensive, and so I'll factor that into my thinking.
And I mean, just to give a comparison, I mean, there are other parts of the world, including Europe and Japan, where the price of carbon is already much higher than in the United States, right? Sometimes, in fact, more than double in some places. So we are still looking at relatively small increases compared to what it's already priced in other parts of the world.
That's right. And again, the important thing is to get started, right? Yeah. And as we do that, the tax exposure gets reduced for people as well, because they're able to make those shifts, right? Okay. And so you're hopefully, over time, the only people who are paying the tax are the people who can afford it and just don't care.
Right. And especially with something like carbon pricing, both one of the criticisms and one of the things to watch out for is you don't negatively impact those who can least bear that impact, right? And
right.
Let's say I'm an Uber driver and I drive a lot, and you could argue that my miles are not tied to my desire to drive, but because I am a service provider. And the more expensive gas gets, the more difficult it is for me to make money, because I don't necessarily, unless Uber raises fares for all of us, right? So how do you counter that kind of argument? How do you tell that person that, look, there is opportunity here for two?
Right. So this is where the rebate is really important, right? So to give an unrelated example, when we tried to get taxi drivers in Boston to adopt hybrid vehicles, right? And so you would make the argument to them, well, hey, your per mile operating cost is going to be cheaper, right? So you could make more money. And that is true, but their upfront cost would be higher because the hybrid was more expensive. Mm-hmm. So in that case, a corporation, Whole Foods, stepped in and said, well, we will sponsor some part of the cost mm-hmm. of these hybrid taxis in return for getting advertising on the roof, right, to make it more appealing to the taxi drivers, right? So they got in a sense, they got a rebate, right, up front that says, we'll take down the upfront cost and then you keep the savings on the operating cost, right? Mm-hmm. In the case of the carbon price, we would do something similar where the rebate that the Uber driver would get, right, would be substantial, right? Because, you know, if you're, let's say you're going to drive Uber, you have a choice. You could say, well, I'm going to use my, you know, big polluting SUV, or I'm going to drive Uber in a Prius, right? Well, if you're driving in a Prius, you get the same rebate either way. So if you're driving in a Prius, you're spending a lot less on gas, but you're getting the same rebate as the person driving the SUV. And so that creates an incentive to drive a more efficient vehicle, right? And then, of course, you want to structure the carbon fee or price so that, you know, the Prius driver gets back more than they spend, and the SUV driver gets back less than they spend. So it creates the incentive for all the drivers to use more efficient vehicles.